Hello, good morning, and a warm welcome to the Berwick Literary Festival for what we're calling Free Fridays, because throughout the day here at the Berwick Literary Festival via Zoom, there's a series of really interesting conversations to be had. My name is Gerry Foley. I'm a journalist and an interviewer, and I was lucky enough to meet today's guest in person at another book festival last week, and that's her honour, Wendy Joseph, KC. So, Wendy, firstly, lovely to renew acquaintance with you. We had a very lovely time together last week, and I'm sure we're going to cover lots of interesting topics in your very well received and excellent book, Unlawful Killings. So, Wendy, firstly, it's not a memoir. We'll come to how the book is structured in a moment. But just, you started as a barrister in 1975 and you retired from the Old Bailey in March of this year, age 70. But it's quite a big do when you leave as a senior judge. Tell us what happened on your last day in the job.
Well, first of all, it's good to see you again, Gerry. Last day in the job. So Old Bailey judges, on the day they retire, get what's called a valedictory, which means you sit on the bench in the central seat in Court 1 at the Old Bailey, probably the most iconic courtroom in the world. And beside you are the great and the good who've taken the trouble to come down and see you off. And in front of you in the courtroom, there will be packed numbers of the staff that you've worked with over the years, the barristers who were your mates over the years, the younger barristers who are coming up behind you, nosy jurors who want to see what's going on. Your whole life is sort of laid out in front of you there. And it's like looking at all the people who've marched along that route with you.
It must have been quite emotional because, you know, for anybody who steps away from any job, it's a big moment in your life. But then to have all of these nice things said about you, sometimes you feel, why didn't you say that when I was still in the job or then on my last day? But, you know, when you hung up your wig and your gown for the last time, must have been a fair degree of emotion.
A lot of emotion. It's a very strange feeling because it's one of the few jobs that has that sort of uniform that takes away your personality. Now, that's the purpose of it. The purpose of the uniform is that the people in the courtroom shouldn't think that's Wendy up on the bench. They should think that's the judge up on the bench. And it leaves a bit of a hollow when you take it off for the last time and pack it up and put it in mothballs and put it away.
Now, so you started as a criminal barrister back in 1975, and this aspect of your life isn't covered in the book, but in a series of interviews you've done in and around the book, you make it pretty clear that it wasn't easy for young female barristers, either professionally or sometimes personally, to get the respect that they should get. So on the professional side, sometimes you saw other male pupils of your same age being snapped up by chambers, and you were wondering why the offers weren't coming your way. And then the other aspect of it was sometimes inappropriate behavior by other people within the broader judicial system in terms of being over-friendly.
Yeah, I think the two things were linked, really. It was the general view back in 1975 that women weren't taken seriously. That's not to say there weren't some absolutely brilliant women barristers who were indeed Queen's Counsel back then. But there was a general feeling that women were playing at it and not being taken seriously. I certainly wasn't.
Yes, and you tell a story, actually, how the mindset lasted even to when you became a judge in the Old Bailey, which was 2012, in terms of, again, there's a tradition, a new judge is sitting on the bench. You were the only woman at that time out of 16. It's more equally balanced now. But the senior counsel had to get their head around the fact you shouldn't be called your lordship, which they made the mistake of repeating on several occasions.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I wouldn't like anyone to think that there hadn't been progress made between 1975 and 2012. There were a lot more women at the bar by 2012, and there were a lot of women judges by then, although comparatively speaking, few compared to the men. But when I was sent to the Old Bailey in 2012, there were 16 full-time Old Bailey judges, 15 men and me. And there had been two other women before me, one in the 1970s to 80s, and one in the 90s. Oh, forgive me.
Keep going. Yeah, you put your little. It's tricky to get. Yeah. So you were just telling us about your predecessors, but then you arrived in 2012.
So so there was one in the 1970s and 80s, and one in the 1990s, early 2000s. But there hadn't been a woman there for a long time, and all the men advocates, and indeed women advocates, were used to judging men on the bench. So on the first morning, when I was being welcomed by the most senior barrister in my courtroom, and he said, it's wonderful to have you, and may your reign be long and happy. Although I always rather think it really ought to have been something closer to brace yourself. But he kept addressing me as my lord, and it wasn't malicious. He just couldn't get his head around it. And the first time he did it, I pretended I was deaf. Second time he did it, I pretended confusion. And the third time he did it, I thought, we really can't go on like this. But it sounds so pompous to say, well, you've got that wrong. So I just looked long and hard down my cleavage. And when I looked up again, he was completely scarlet, and he didn't make that mistake again. And neither did anybody else.
Now, coming to the book itself, in terms of how you went about to frame it, because you detail 6 cases, you make it clear that these aren't actual individual cases, but they are a representation of wider points you want to make about aspects of the legal system, and also in particular how the judge has to steer that course, guide the jury, run the court and everything else. One of the ones I want to start with is the one at the end, because it's very much about the role of the jury, and all of us are potential juries. In fact, you mentioned last week you yourself had served on a jury. So before we get into the book, what was that like sitting on the other side and seeing it from the point of view of just a member of the public?
An eye-opener. It was a real eye-opener. You learn a lot about the way 12 people sit down together and discuss problems and how they resolve them. Yeah.
Now, you've also mentioned in the book a few of the examples which were cited in front of you by people who were claiming they were either too busy or it would be too uncomfortable to be sitting on the same bench for 3 or 4 weeks as a member of a jury, or they couldn't travel by tube because it was too dirty. But you were pretty strict in saying, it is your civic responsibility to serve on the jury unless you have a very good excuse.
Well, the thing is, Gerry, that we run this system, the jury system, and we, run it up the flagpole. We say it's the most brilliant system in the world. And it is a good system. It has its faults, but it is a good system. I can't think of a system that works better, but we can only run the system if people are prepared to come and sit as jurors. And if they won't, the system collapses. So it really is important that people are prepared to do it. But my experience is, reluctant as people are, sometimes because they're frightened, sometimes because of the time commitment, once they get into it, once they start to listen to a serious case where other people's lives are in their hands, they take it very responsibly, they get very involved, and they genuinely try to find the right answers according to what they see as the right answers.
Well, that's a lovely cue for this case that I'm referring to, the last case, to get the right answer or what they see as the right answer, because, of course, the jury are totally independent. They're free to listen to all of the evidence, and they're equally free to come up with this last case, and I'll outline it briefly, and then you can explain why it was such a surprise verdict. It was basically the wife of a career criminal over 20 years. He was an armed robber. He'd been violent on occasion towards his wife, and there was physical evidence to that. But equally, they'd lived a very high lifestyle, so she enjoyed some of the benefits of his proceeds of crime. And she was charged with his murder. There was a struggle involving a gun in the house, and she shot him in the head. Now, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Because she was quite a strong witness in her own right.
Yeah, it was the situation that this story describes is one in which the jury took what seemed to them a moral rather than a legal view. This woman was faced with a situation in which an abusive husband, who had produced a lot of money over the years from which she'd enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, was about to set off on a further spree of violent crime with a gun. And she suddenly decided she had had enough of it. And she took the gun and she shot him. And her defense was, he came at me with the gun, there was a struggle, it was an accident. But the ballistic evidence suggested it couldn't have been like that because of the angle at which the gun was fired, the position that he was, the way in which the bullet went into his head. So the evidence was overwhelmingly that she had deliberately shot him. And the jury heard all the evidence. And it was very hard to see what other case there was to put against the force of this evidence. But they acquitted her.
Yes, and you went to talk to some of your fellow judges, and some of your colleagues brought you right down into the bowels of the Old Bailey to look at a famous plaque which references back to the 1660s, I think, when William Penn, the Quaker, was up on a charge of unlawful gathering preaching. And the jury refused to indict him. And not only that, they were punished for refusing to indict him because the Crown felt the evidence was overwhelming. They were locked up, the jury, and starved, but they didn't change their mind. And it's their right to come to the verdict they considered to be the fair one.
Yeah, so what happened back in those days was that the jury listened to the evidence and refused to convict William Penn. They said that he was not guilty. And the judge said, but all the evidence shows that he is guilty. I won't accept your verdict of not guilty. And he sent them away to think again, and they thought again, and they came back and they still said not guilty. And in the end, he locked them up and said, you're behaving improperly. And the Lord Chief Justice came riding down Old Bailey on his horse and released them and said, it is a jury's right to do that. It is the jury's right to bring in the verdict they believe is the right verdict. And there's nothing that can be done about it. And it was only a short time after I wrote that story, and I could have had no idea that this was going to happen, that there was a not dissimilar incident following the trial in Bristol, where a statue was torn down, statue of a slave trader was torn down at Colston, I think.
Edward Colston, yeah.
And thrown into the harbour. And there was no doubt at all that the people who were indicted had pulled down the statue, had participated in dragging it to the harbour, and had participated in throwing it in. And they were charged with criminal damage. And if that isn't criminal damage, I'm not sure I know what is. But the jury took a different view. And so there is now and currently being considered the possibility of reviewing the situation where a jury does that. But at present and historically, it's always been the jury's right to do that. And it's a sort of check on an over-authoritarian regime. It puts power in the hands of 12 ordinary people.
And it was great to have such a recent example of it to back that up. Just a reminder to people who are watching and listening, of course, via the chat button, you can send in some questions. I'll be talking for probably another 15, 20 minutes with Wendy, and then hopefully we'll have some viewers' questions. You make the point throughout the book that by the time the defendants and the victims who are being represented in the court arrive at the Old Bailey, it's already a human tragedy. These are very, very serious cases. And one I wanted to address, which was the case of an Asian family, a husband and wife with a 16-year-old daughter, a 9-year-old daughter, and I think a 4-year-old boy. The 16-year-old girl is beginning to assert her independence, beginning to dress in a more Western way, hanging out with friends that her parents don't approve of. And tragically, she's killed, murdered in her own home. And this whole case really centers about how you deal with evidence from extremely young and vulnerable children. So just tell us about how you go about it. It's called achieving best evidence. How does that work in practice?
So in that case, the mother and father were both in the dock. The older child was dead, and the only witnesses who had been in the house were the two younger children, a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. And there's a whole procedure these days where we try to make it easier for vulnerable witnesses, as they're called, which includes child witnesses, to give their evidence. So a trial may not come into the courtroom for months, sometimes years after an event takes place. And a child's memory is not going to be accurate a long time later. If a child is having nightmares, every time they think about it or dream about it, the memory will become modified and altered. So it's very important to capture a memory as early as you can. And the procedure that's used, which is called achieving best evidence, is specially trained officers will take that first statement from a child by recording what the child has to say in a special suite where everything is video and audio recorded, so everything can be checked to make sure there's no unfairness. The child will give a first account as best they can, without interruption, and then will be gently questioned, not cross-examined, but gently questioned, not led, but encouraged to remember as much as they can around what they've already said. That creates that child's evidence in chief. And that recording can be played to the jury as the child's evidence in chief whenever the trial takes place. Then there has to be cross-examination. And until recently, the child still had to be cross-examined at the time of the trial itself. But now we have a new system that will allow an interim hearing, maybe a few months after events when the defense have had time to put their case together, where the child will give evidence and be cross-examined from a remote witness room by a barrister in the courtroom, under the eyes of a judge, so everything is supervised by the judge. And that cross-examination is then recorded and will again be played to the jury after the ABE interview. So
well, you say, sorry, Wendy, just a second, because you made the point in that particular chapter, and you reference it there again, under the supervision of the judge, because there's several moments in that chapter where you have to remind some of the senior barristers that you are dealing with a vulnerable child here. You have to be sensitive. Obviously, they have a job to do on behalf of their client, but not all of them were as aware of the sensitivities as they perhaps should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult if you're a very clever barrister and you've got a lot of long words in your head. It's quite difficult if the judge says to you, no multiple words, no multiple sentences, no multiple clauses, no multiple questions, simple single questions, no complicated language, no tags on the end. So, for example, to say, he didn't hit you, isn't that right? For a child to understand a structure like that is very complicated. To say somebody else hit you, isn't that right? might lead a child to say no, because it isn't right to hit me.
Yes.
It's wrong to hit
me. Complicated.
So, so it's very difficult sometimes for adults who are used to dealing with things very cerebrally to get their heads around the fact their job is to communicate with a child.
When you talk about communicating with a child, a feature and a strong feature throughout the book, not only in terms of cases you examine, but in terms of the wider issues surrounding society, not only the criminal justice system, but society and how people end up in front of you at the Old Bailey, is, of course, the dreadful continuing problem of gangs and knife violence. You have a case in here, the dead man, the dead boy, who's only 15, the three accused, I think 16, 17, and 18. And this is something that you saw, unfortunately, multiple times.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying earlier, Gerry, once I get a case in front of me, and once I used to get a case in front of me in the courtroom, it's too late. No judge can put it right. If there's a dead child on a mortuary table, no judge can bring that child back to life. No judge can repair the harm that's done if a 16-year-old defendant goes to prison and isn't going to come out until he's in his 30s. The harm's already done. And the damage that's done by children joining gangs is unmeasurable. And I saw it all the time, constantly. Really young children, and 13, 14, not 13 so much, but 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And yes, they are defendants. And if they've done wrong, they have, of course, to be dealt with in the court system. But as well as being defendants, if they were yours or mine, we'd say these are children, and they are.
And you make the point that we, as a society, have to look at the broader issues as to how so many people, youngsters, are ending up in that situation where they feel they have to be part of a gang, they have to carry knives, and some of the weapons that you describe, I mean, these just aren't ordinary kitchen knives anymore. They're highly serrated blades, which are designed to do the most damage. Yeah.
A lot of work's been done on knife crime, a lot of work by a lot of worthy people, lots of work by bereaved families who've lost a child to knife crime. And I applaud everything that they're doing. But as a society, we sort of need to get our heads around there isn't one reason why kids carry knives. There's a whole barrage of reasons that come together. So children excluded from school and wandering round are absolutely prime candidates for getting into trouble. Children who are frightened of others who are carrying knives may end up carrying knives. Children who want to carry knives to impress, because, as you say, some of these knives are real status symbols these days. Children who are carrying knives because they are carrying drugs and are frightened of being robbed of the drugs. Children who are carrying knives because they feel they've been disrespected in some way, and they haven't got their heads around the fact there are other, better, easier, and more civilized ways of putting right what they see as a wrong than the use of a knife. So multiple causes all coming together. We really need to do something about it, because where we are at the moment is not a good place.
No, absolutely, and tragically so. There is another case which is in some ways at the other end of the social spectrum, I suppose, and this is the case of involving a very middle-class family. The mother, her daughter was about 20, Ruth, has had a baby, and the baby's only about 3 or 4 months old, living in this nice house. The parents are very supportive of Ruth and her newborn. They don't know who the father was or the nature of the relationship, because Ruth didn't share that with them. But the mum, Mrs. Manders in this case, goes up to the nursery, if you like, and she looks in to see Ruth hovering over the baby, and she thought that she's sort of, patting her, but then thinks she sees, in fact, is convinced she sees Ruth trying to put a soft toy as if to suffocate the little baby, and then rings the police, and it's a very messy situation which evolves from there and ends up in front of you.
Yeah, this story tells of the situation where what I was really concerned to get across is where there is a crime behind closed doors, and the only witness is someone who cares very much about both the victim and the perpetrator. The appalling position it is for a family member to come along and be asked to give evidence against someone they love. And many, many crimes are committed in households, in families, behind closed doors, and more people than you imagine are put in this position. So this was a mother who made her statement to the police at the very beginning, saying what she'd seen when she was very distressed about it. But when it came to the trial of her daughter, did not want to give evidence about her. And it deals both with the story from the position of the mother who doesn't want to give evidence, and also the judge who's got to try and ensure that justice is done.
Yes, and you had to be, several times make it clear to the mother that she was defying the will of the court. And there's quite complicated legal technology, not technology, but technicalities, which are dealt with in terms of how she eventually is able to give some evidence. But there is a further tragic twist in the story, which I don't know if you want to give away now, but it's important because, again, it reflects society and stories that we hear all too often about teenage girls and the vulnerable situations they find themselves in.
So as the story unravels, it becomes important to understand why Ruth might have done what her mother thinks she saw her doing. Because on the face of it, all right, this was a young girl who got pregnant, but she saw the pregnancy through, and there's a lovely baby born, and she's got the support of her parents. So why on earth would she do the sort of thing that she did? And it eventually becomes clear it all has to do with who the father of the baby was. And in fact, Ruth is younger than, I think you mentioned her being.
She was 20. This goes back to her school days.
So she had still been at school and left school, and it emerges that there was an abuser within the school who was the father of the baby, and it was being abandoned by him. It was trying to get his attention. It was an understanding that she would never get any support from him and that she had been used and abused by him that led Ruth to do what her mother rightly saw her doing. And it's such a mess. These things do happen, but how do you solve that problem? I mean, you can bring people to justice, but you can't undo what's happened.
That's very true. But as with all of these cases and chapters, you do bring it to resolution. But the logic of how you get to that resolution is a key part of each case, because you set out very clearly the guidance you give to juries and step by step leading them to help them to make the right judgment. Another question is in relation to another case involving domestic violence, which is called The Good Soldier. And this is a former soldier, obviously, who is suffering from post-traumatic stress. He lives with his wife, who's a much respected and loved teacher. And he's taking medication late at night, and it all goes horribly wrong, and he kills his wife. And then it becomes a question of, A, is he fit to stand trial? So he has to have a psychiatrist report. And eventually, when it does come before you, because he has a report from a psychiatrist, the whole modus operandi of the trial is different, because actually it's the defense who have to, if you like, lead and prove their case rather than the prosecution having to convince the jury. So explain how that works and what are the possible outcomes when there's a psychiatric report in the background.
So, as you would readily understand, many people who come into the dock in the courtrooms have got psychiatric problems. These days, there is such a lacuna, such a hole in the proper supply of help for people who are mentally ill in society, that you constantly get people in the courtrooms who perhaps would never have been there if help had been available in good order. And that was very obvious in COVID, very obvious during the pandemic. So in this story, we explore the situation where the defense isn't, I didn't do it. The defense is, I did it, but my mind was in such a state that my responsibility for what I did was diminished by mental illness. And the defense is called diminished responsibility. And instead of the prosecution having to prove that he did have the required intent and prove it beyond reasonable doubt, prove it so that the jury is sure, in these cases, the defendant bears the burden of proving that his responsibility was diminished. But he doesn't have to prove it so the jury is sure. He only has to prove it on a balance of possibilities.
We've got some sense in the conversation, more than a sense, of the extraordinary responsibility of everybody involved in the criminal justice system. But you're sitting there day after day, year after year, dealing with these awful tragedies and the most serious of crimes. But what comes out of the book, which is so nice as well, you get a sense of the support network you had amongst fellow judges. And I love the moments you go back into the judge's tea room and you describe it beautifully. It's like any tea room where everybody has their eye on the best biscuits. And sometimes you're saying, oh, he's already taken the nice chocolate ones. But apart from being competitive when it comes to biscuits, it's a real support network, isn't it? Because you can chat to one another.
It really is. And, the way we've been talking about it, Gerry, it sounds terribly complicated because we've been talking a lot about the law and the defenses. But criminal cases really are about people. They really are, the stories are about the problems that people have found or stumbled into or not been able to extricate themselves from, the difficulties they've had with their lives, which have crossed the criminal law. And at the Old Bailey, there are quite a large number of judges, between 14 and 16. And we are all facing the same problems day in, day out. So although we can talk to each other about the technicalities, my gosh, there's a lot of technicalities in the law, we are also a great support system to each other because as you can imagine, dealing day in, day out with bereaved families, distraught defendants, witnesses who can barely bring themselves to recount what they have seen, jurors who are shocked at what they're hearing as the stories unfold in front of them. All of that does take its toll. But if you're working with others who understand what you're going through, it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, I can imagine it would. And another element which comes out in the book, which I hadn't realized beforehand, was that the Old Bailey court building system itself is actually owned by the Corporation of the City of London. And quite often, as part of your working day, the judges, when they go to lunch, are actually almost like on show themselves because the city will invite in different experts. It could be a medical expert. It could be somebody who's a historian or a scientist. So there you are, hoping to have a nice lunch, but you're actually having to entertain almost the special guest brought in by the city to the Old Bailey. So that adds another element to your day.
Yeah, we're a floor show. That's what it comes down to. So the Old Bailey, unlike any other court building that I know of, isn't actually owned by His Majesty's Court Service, Courts and Tribunals Service. It's actually owned by the City of London, and the courts, as it were, are rented by and run by our service. But other parts of the building are occupied by the City of London, and in particular the sheriffs, who actually, there's 2 sheriffs each year, they change each year, they actually live there. So, if they've got a friendly Labrador, we find we have a friendly Labrador running around the corridor. It's very good. But they are there to represent the city. They lay on a lunch every day, and they invite 3, 4, 5 guests. And the judges go to lunch every day. And so you end up sitting next to really interesting people, which is great if you are able to put out of your mind whatever's just been going on in your courtroom, or you haven't got something you really need to sort out before you go back at 2:00 into your courtroom. But it's a huge privilege because you meet so many different people.
It does, actually. Yeah, a great chance. The reason I hesitated for a moment is I was just looking at some of the questions which have come in. And here's one from Liz Alex. Do you like reading murder mysteries and police procedurals? If so, and you may not want to, it's a busman's holiday in some way, I suppose, but what errors do you see authors making with respect to how court cases are handled? And do you get upset if they're making a lot of mistakes?
I don't read that many police procedurals because actually it is quite irritating when you can see things happening that just couldn't happen. And there's an awful lot of stuff on the television as well that you're thinking, oh, come on, you just can't do that. But it's no good me jumping up and down in front of the television or throwing a book to the floor. So I tend on the whole not to watch or listen to or read those things.
But you are a great reader. And again, looking at your own history, when you went to Cambridge, initially you studied English for the first 2 years before switching to law. And I should say one of the really distinctive features of the book is before each case, you describe, beautifully written, these little vignettes of what happened leading up to the crime in question. So you obviously have always enjoyed writing. So now you have a lot more time to continue writing and to read even more. So you taking advantage of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Gerry, it's the most extraordinary thing. If I was 7 years old and you were saying to me, what do you want to be when I was 7? I would have said a writer. My dad had read to me the Just So stories and how the alphabet was made. And I thought the idea that you could make a shape that made a sound and you could put those shapes together to make words and put the words together to make stories and then send the stories into somebody else's head. When I was 7, I thought that was completely magical. And I always wanted to be a writer until I had been a couple of years at university. And my mum said, how exactly are you planning on making a living? And it was then that I changed to law. So it is curious that at the age of 70, I'm right back where I was when I was 7, except that it isn't curious in a way, because a criminal barrister's work is all about words. It's not like being a patent lawyer or, doing chancery work or whatever. You are all the time an advocate. It is always the art of persuasion. And it's the use of words to persuade, how you put words together, where you put the pauses between words. All of those things are part of the life of a criminal barrister.
And also uncovering the stories. It's all about the human stories and finding out behind.
Absolutely.
Here's a question actually from Karen Jones. Do you think there should be specialist barristers who have had specialist training communicating with children? Now, there are police officers who are trained in that. Are there a number of barristers who will go on special courses so they know when they're dealing with vulnerable witnesses, particularly young children?
Yes, there are. There are lots of courses that barristers go on and are expected to go on, and they get what are called CPD points, so continuing professional development points. And judges get a lot of help as well in dealing with this. So we are all getting training, but some people, having been trained, are rather better at it than others. But Karen is absolutely right, because the victims of crime are so often the most vulnerable people in our community, and not just children, but those who are mentally ill or those who are physically weaker. And it is so important that the professionals who are dealing with them can deal with them in a way that means they get proper access to justice, that their cases in which they are the victims, or they claim they are the victims, are properly heard and tried, and they can partake in that properly.
And of course, one of your additional roles when you were at the Old Bailey was as a community and diversity judge. So you were very involved in trying to encourage people from all sorts of backgrounds into the law, but also you would have groups of school children, teenage kids coming into the Old Bailey to get an understanding and perhaps raise their awareness about, you don't really want to end up here on the wrong side and standing in the dock rather than just coming to see it as a public visitor. But you really enjoyed that aspect of your work.
I did. I mean, the book starts with a group of school children coming in after my court day and me having to sort of relate to them, which is, when you've been working since 6 o'clock in the morning and you've got a lot more work to do when you go home in the evening, it is quite difficult to get your mindset out of where you were and into a group of 14-year-olds. But it is so rewarding.
But it's a great introduction, Wendy, because you hear some of the noises off, as they say, some of the teenagers sort of shouting at the teachers, more or less, why the hell do we have to be here? And then you begin to see the characters within the school group. Yeah. And it's a great way of illustrating the different roles and getting the kids to think about also the role of the jury and the fact that you have 12 people who have to argue the discussion and come to a conclusion. And you think that's something which would be good for schools in general to implement?
I do, Gerry, because, I saw jurors day in, day out for nearly half a century altogether. And the fact is, some jurors have real difficulty sitting down discussing things. Some are too shy to advance their views. Some are too quick to advance their views and override other people's views. The ability to look at a problem, talk it through, express your view, listen to other people's views, moderate your view if it requires moderation. Those are real skills. And we don't teach our children, at least not as far as I know, we don't. And they are life skills. You could slip them into any sort of area within the school curriculum, but they are life skills. And I don't see any reason why groups of children, be it 6, 8, 10 or 12, shouldn't sit down together and be given a problem to discuss and unravel, and taught how to take their time, frame what they need to say, to listen, which is a real art, to what other people have to say. And then between you to take the different views and moderate them so that you come up with the best answer.
There's a very interesting question from Gay Mulholland, which is that sometimes when jurors have been involved in a particularly long, difficult, maybe gruesome case, they're given an exemption from jury service for maybe another 15 years or whatever. But what about judges like your good self, day after day, year after year, sitting through some very traumatic, violent evidence? Is there some support back up to help judges to process that themselves, or you more or less said, that's what you signed up to, you're going to the Old Bailey, you know what you're going to be facing?
Yeah, well, they certainly don't give us an exemption from work for doing it. But it is what we've signed up for. You know what the job is. If you go to the Old Bailey, Almost every case you do will have a dead or a nearly dead body in it. That isn't true of other Crown courts. It's the central criminal court. We have the biggest, the most serious, the most complex cases. We do a bit of terrorism there, but a lot of the really serious terrorism is done out at Woolwich Crown Court because it's got different security arrangements and it's adjacent to Belmarsh Prison. And we do a bit of other stuff, bit of drugs, because drugs so often leads to really violent acts. But it is the job, and we are the specialists in that field. And I don't like to say that we get hardened to it. I don't think you ever become hardened to the tragedies, but you learn to put it in its proper place so that, when you close the book, you close the book.
It's the only way in many professions, isn't it? Firefighters, police, doctors, when they're dealing with very difficult cases. There's another question from Karen Fox here, which is the accidental barrister and different books which have come out behind the scenes, what's really going on. They tend to paint a picture of a system in crisis, and this is something that you refer to in your own book as well. And we've seen examples of this just in the last few weeks, the barristers' strike, which is temporarily stopped, but also new Crown Court figures showing massive delays, even worse than during COVID itself. So Karen's point is the system in crisis? And it's probably a big ask, but how can it be fixed?
Well, the system is in crisis. There's no doubt about that at all. In order to fix it, you've got to work out what went wrong. And what went wrong is, as always, a whole load of things. If there were an easy answer, you wouldn't be asking the question. We'd have sorted it. But first of all, there's always a backlog of cases in these big cases because it takes quite a long time for everybody involved, both sides, with many defendants, many sides, to be ready for trial. So that's the first thing. There's always a backlog. Secondly, everything is money driven. So to prepare a complicated case, a murder case, you may need experts dealing with blood, experts dealing with DNA, experts dealing with telephone evidence, experts from all sorts of areas. Money has got to be found for all of them to be instructed by the Crown and then for the defence to respond. The more you cut money, the longer it takes everything to get organised. Next, COVID hit very, very hard because many Crown courts closed down altogether. The Bailey didn't, but we were only running, instead of running 14 trials at a time, at one stage we were running 2 at a time, 3 at a time,
Huge.
4 at a time. Yeah. Huge backlog of cases built up over that. Then, of course, we had the barristers' strike. And I don't take sides on this, but I do say that the barristers were awarded 15% by government-led investigation before all of this inflation and stuff started. And with them being told that was what they were going to get, only for new cases. And since cases are now taking 2 years to go through, they were going to get their rise in a few years' time. So what I would say is this: your view on that depends on where you're standing. If you were the defendant or a member of a defendant's family waiting trial, or the victim or the victim's family waiting trial, you'd take a pretty poor view of it. If you were barristers, you would take a different view of it. If you stand right outside of the whole thing and say, what happens if it goes on like it is? And what is happening is the bar is hemorrhaging, absolutely hemorrhaging.
Which has major implications for the future, obviously.
There'll be no one left to do the cases. There'll be no one left to become forgive me, Your Majesty, the KC. There'll be no one left to become judges. So, but that's being sorted out. All of these problems are solvable with a lot of money. But money only goes so far. And our system needs money. So does the hospital system.
Yes.
So does the NHS. So does education. Thank goodness it's above my pay grade to make those decisions. But Karen's right. The system is in crisis. And we need to think of ways of dealing with it. And there are ways. So a lot of ways have been looked at, but looked at individually and simply been called unworkable. Suggestions that the magistrate should have a much higher level of sentencing and so many fewer cases should go to the Crown Courts. Suggestions that the Crown Courts should work 2 shifts a day instead of 1 shift a day. So many more cases can go through. Lots of suggestions along those routes. And the answer is, because they've all been knocked out of the ballpark at some stage, you need not to say, here's an idea. Oh my goodness, here's a lot of problems with that idea. Let's forget that idea. You need to take from the ideas what is good, and from all the ideas what is good, and then see what you can do, because there are ways of dealing with this.
Well, as you say, an open mind, a willingness perhaps to experiment, but you're very clear about the crisis and the impact of the crisis. One thing which always puzzled me occasionally, I was mainly a political journalist, but occasionally I would have to go to the Court of Criminal Appeal or the High Court just to follow a case which was involving somebody from the Northeast. How do judges and barristers manage to schedule their diaries? Because when you start a case, you say this may run for 2 or 3 weeks, but of course it could end up running for 4 or 5 weeks. And everybody is tied into that. And sometimes you see barristers scuttling from one court to the other. I mean, it must be quite tricky.
It's very tricky. It's the job of the barrister's clerk and the court's list office to try and get it right. But it's one of the reasons we have backlogs, because cases are scheduled for 3 weeks. And so another case is then scheduled for the 4th week. If the first case overruns by another 2 weeks, what happens to the next case? There's nowhere for it to be tried. So it's a huge problem. We are dependent on the barristers making correct assessments about the length of cases, both in their own interests, for their own diaries, and for the court's diaries.
You mentioned the barristers there. Obviously, for the best part of 30 years, you were both a prosecution and defense barrister yourself. But there are some nice little drawings of some of the idiosyncratic natures and the tricks that some barristers try to use. And sometimes you get a story from the judge's tea room when a particular barrister is mentioned. They sort of go, oh no, I hope I'm not dealing with him or her. But that's human nature. People can be abrasive and can have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves which judges might necessarily have approved of, although possibly might have used when they were barristers themselves appearing before a judge.
I'm not sure I could comment on that.
But it is a nice little moment as well. And it goes back, as I say, to the strength of your writing. So it's been very well received, the book, and got a lot of well-deserved publicity. But I'm presuming you're not putting down your pen or closing down your laptop. You have lots of more ideas, not necessarily just on your direct experience, perhaps. Is there a novel waiting within yourself?
There's possibly a novel, and there is likely, I think, to be another follow-on from the one that right. I've done.
Now, one of the questions we got was in terms of, do you read many crime books yourself? But one interview I did see as a kid, your favorite detective was Sherlock Holmes. And was it his absolute rigor and adherence to logic? Because obviously as a judge, you have to be very logical. You have to be step by step. You're telling the jury as you officially steps to verdict.
Yeah, I mean, clear thinking is part of a judge's job. And I do admire that. I really do. Life is so complicated. If you're talking to someone who can actually see things clearly and express things clearly, it makes my life so much easier. And I admire that very much in characters in books as well.
Now, about 2 months after you left the Old Bailey, Wendy, we had the first live televised sentencing by one of your Judge Munro, I think it was.
Sarah Munro, yes.
Sarah Munro. Were you a little bit disappointed you didn't get the chance to be the first to deliver the TV verdict?
I was very glad I wasn't.
It would just be a little bit nerve-wracking to have the camera there. And
the procedure is meant to demystify. And I'm all for that. The courts are there to serve people. And if people can't understand what's going on, what is the point? That's really why I wrote the book, so that everyone could understand what's really happening. But the case that was being sentenced was such a complicated case with so many complicated aspects of law to it. I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't they choose a shoplifting or something for the first one so that we could have all really understood and then bit by bit come to terms with the complexities of it. But Sarah did it beautifully, as she always would.
And was there much discussion amongst judges in the sort of year leading up to get the all clear for this to happen? Because we see the Supreme Court quite often on TV now, but this was a big step. We got a pretty big step for the justice system to have the sentencing live from the Old Bailey.
I think it was, although we've had televised hearings in the Court of Appeal for some time now on important cases or cases that have significance for the public. And the Old Bailey judges usually, not all of them, but most of them, I did, sit for a stint every year in the Court of Appeal Criminal Division, a sort of three-week stint every year. And so we were all trained in not waving our arms around too much and sitting as still as we could and not speaking too fast. So we'd all had a bit of training in that. But it is quite a big thing to televise something from a Crown Court. You've got to remember it's only sentencing remarks.
Yes.
It's not the trial, it's not the evidence, it's not the jury, it's not the barristers.
We're not going the American route, no.
We're not going the American route yet. It is just one judge sitting quietly in his or her robes giving the sentencing remarks. But it was important.
You mentioned last week, actually, that one of the best pieces of advice you got when you became a judge was a simple 2-word phrase which you wrote and put in front of your desk when you were sitting in the Old Bailey. Do you want to reveal what those words were?
Yeah, when I first became a judge, and it happens to a lot of young judges, I think, I just couldn't resist interfering. I just wanted to get down there and get stuck in, ask some questions, criticize some things that were going on. And I knew I was doing it too much. And I went to speak to someone high up, very high up. And I said, can you give me some advice about this? And he said, yes, get a bit of paper, write in big letters, shut up, and put it in front of yourself. And it works.
Well, one of the great things about now that you are out and about talking about your books, and hopefully there's more to come, is you don't have to shut up. You're free to have your own voice. And last question, really, as we're coming towards the end. Thanks to everybody who put in the questions. And don't forget, Unlawful Killings by Wendy Joseph, KC, is available, as I say, in all good bookshops, and it really is a very good read. Are you enjoying being part of the sort of literary festival circuit? Because I got the impression last week you like hanging around with other authors. I know you're busy, you don't always have that much time to stay, but you like going to book festivals now.
I do. The whole I mean, it sounds so naive, but the whole thing has come as a complete surprise to me. I thought you wrote the book and it sold or it didn't sell, and you were asked to write another one or you weren't. It hadn't occurred to me that there was this whole world out there of people who go around talking about books, and it's entirely wonderful.
Well, I want to say on behalf of everybody involved with the Berwick Literary Festival, thank you for taking the time, because I know you are very busy and very much in demand. And what a great way to kick off here our Free Friday. There are more conversations on Zoom via our website throughout the day. But Her Honour, Wendy Joseph, KC. Wendy, lovely to talk to you again, and hopefully we might see each other somewhere over the next year or so. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
And thanks again to everybody for tuning in.